So the other day, Magic Mula brought up a very interesting question. Can any deck easily win if you're really good, or does meta really influence chance of winning on top of your own personal skill? Now, to more experienced players who have been around the TCG sphere, played some competitive, this is probably a pretty easy question to answer. But for those of you who are a bit new, or maybe just have stuck with casual, this might be a question that you've thought of before and maybe not gotten a full answer for, so I thought it'd be an interesting topic to discuss in this video. But real quick before I get started, I'm sorry if you can hear a little whirring noise in the background. I've got some fans going because you don't mess with water damage. I don't think it's being picked up too much. You might not even hear it, but I do apologize for that, and next video it should be gone. So to start out with, I want to nitpick Mula's question just a little bit. He said, can any deck win easily if you're really good? Now, I'm going to change good to skillful for the sake of this argument, because that's really what Mula is trying to get at, and I think good is just such a very loose word. It means it's very subjective in what it means, and I don't feel like going down that rabbit hole for that discussion, what constitutes a good player, because really the focus here is skill and skillfulness. And to kind of set the stage here, the definition of skillfulness is having the training, knowledge, and experience that is needed to do something well. Or in the case of card games, it's usually turn out results in a competitive sense, meaning that you're getting top cut, you're winning tournaments, you're consistently winning games in general. And depending on what TCG you are competing in, there are various levels of skill required for that. Typically, the older games such as Yu-Gi-Oh! Are a lot more on the knowledge side of skills, so typically very skilled and knowledgeable players will do better. But then newer games such as Elestrals, there's a lot less to learn, but there's still definitely plenty of skill there. It might just be a bit easier to get up to par with some of the most skilled players. So can a player with more training, more knowledge, more experience, just a more skillful player win easily with any deck? Well, no. That's only part of the equation when it comes to playing well and effectively and turning out results in TCGs. It's really a combination of your own personal skill and your deck building and the deck that you're piloting. All that kind of just intermingles into just being a well-rounded, skillful player, in my opinion. Now, yes, you definitely have a leg up as a more skilled player to pick up any deck and typically run it more optimally than other people, just because you know some of the general play patterns of the game. You know what to look out for, you know what to hold answers for, and how to better sequence your cards into whatever the opponent may be doing, just on a general level. But this is where the deck itself actually comes into play. Not all cards or decks are created equal. That's why we have card rating videos, we've got tier lists for the different decks. That's why a meta exists, because some decks are better than others, some cards are better than others, and part of trying to compete is just figuring out what are the best cards, what are the best decks, what will naturally have a higher win percentage than everything else. And stepping back from just deck versus deck and assuming that they are the most optimally built that they can be, there's also deck building skill involved. It's not easy to build a deck. There's many things to consider, many choices to make, and even the best players will sometimes make deck building mistakes. It's just the nature of it when there's so many variables at play. And while there definitely is a link between deck building skill and player skill, like being able to pilot the deck, they're not necessarily a one-for-one. They definitely help each other. Like, I think if you're a more knowledgeable player, you generally will build better decks, but there's still some skills in deck building that are separate from the play experience that are super important for you to learn. And on that note, a more optimally built deck will have a better chance at winning, just in a vacuum by itself, because that's the whole point of making it more optimal, is that you're trying to increase its win rate percentage. So like a deck that has here in Elestrals is a perfect example, since not everyone was able to get all the cards. Like maybe they just got a booster box and a few starter decks. Maybe they didn't get the Earth one. They don't have Poison Tipped Arrow. Their deck is less optimal in the counter rune remove or control and removal aspect because they don't have those Poison Tipped Arrows. Therefore, likely their deck's just going to be worse than the same deck that is running that Poison Tipped Arrow, even at just 2 copies, though ideally probably 3. Now, I realize talking to some meta players that they think Poison Tipped Arrow really isn't as great as we originally thought, but I think the point still stands, is that in a lot of these decks, Poison Tipped Arrow really does help let it keep up by having more counter rune options, which is the real point I'm trying to make here. So I've talked separately about player skill and how optimally built a deck is, but not really how those two connect and interact. And I think the easiest way to look at it is just with the Punnett square. It's a bit simplified, but I think it'll get the point across. So simply put, on one axis, we just have player skill. On the other side, we have how optimized the deck is. Now, on the two extremes, we've got a unskilled player, probably a new player, using an unoptimized deck. And most likely, they won't win. Maybe against people of the same skill level with the same kind of deck, but that's about it. Anything past that, if the deck is more optimized or the player is more skilled, typically speaking, the player with a more optimized deck or the more skilled player will end up winning. It just simply comes down to both having the better answers to address whatever the opponent plays out, and also having the more skill to better sequence their cards and interact with what they have and what the opponent has. On the opposite extreme, we pretty much have the meta. It's really skilled players playing highly optimized decks. And at that point, it's just really a battle of, one, who doesn't make a misplay, because that's a big thing. Tournaments can get very tiring, but also who kind of guessed the meta right, who had the best deck to play into the meta, and who, to some extent also, who got the more favorable matchups. Like, there's a ton of variables at play in the meta that I could go into that is outside the scope of this video, but the point is that you're in a territory where you can't expect the deck to be necessarily weaker than yours, and you can't expect the player to be less skilled than yours. So a lot of times there is just a lot of very minute differences that can make all the difference to get the edge somehow. I mean, these players are literally the best of the best, but they all can't win. But I think in the cases between meta and new player is where you start to see how these two variables interact with each other. Let's first talk with a very skilled player playing a very unoptimized deck. Most of the time, if they're playing against less skilled players, they'll probably win because they have the more knowledge about how to sequence stuff. I kind of already mentioned this before. But against a player with more skill, you kind of get back into variance playing a factor because both their decks are unoptimized. They know how to properly sequence them. It's just a matter of luck of the draw a lot of the times, and sometimes what their decks actually are. Since you're not getting too highly optimized decks, the variance here is just wild between card power level, just the ratios. Yeah, it's kind of the Wild West, but you can't expect anything out of it. But on the opposite end, if you have a very novice player playing a highly optimized deck, the experienced player definitely has an edge on skill, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a win. As long as the opponent, the less skilled opponent, has at least a basic understanding and recognizes when they have the answer to stuff, a lot of times that variance is what's going to kick the better player's butt in this scenario, because they just can't find it. They know what they need to do, they just can't find the answers. But the opponent, even if they don't necessarily know how to perfect the deck, it's pretty easy to recognize, oh, that's a threat, let me just earthquake it. And they can usually win off of that. Not guaranteed. You kind of have this imbalance here that can sway it, but variance does play a factor. And then kind of dead in the middle is someone who is somewhat experienced. Like, they're definitely not a beginner. They've got a pretty intermediate understanding of the game, but maybe not playing the most optimized deck. And that's where you just kind of get, I think, the bulk of casual, where they're not necessarily playing all the optimized decks. They don't necessarily have the best skill. They're just trying to play what they think is fun. And yeah, that's big bulk of what the community is, and that's a-okay. They probably can easily beat brand new players playing unoptimized decks, but against more skilled players, especially if they're playing meta, they probably don't stand a chance, but a lot of times they're okay with it because that's not what they're interested in. But of course, as I've kind of presented the Punnett square, it is definitely a giant spectrum where people fall on different points. And I think the most important thing when trying to navigate this deck building optimization versus player skill level thing is just figure out what you want out of the game. Are you just there for fun? You don't care if you necessarily make the most optimized play or the most optimized deck? Then probably just be happy with just knowing how to play the game, knowing the rules, and just building zany strategies that you like to see if it works. That's a-okay. If you're a more meta player, obviously you want to hone in your skills. You want to learn a lot, and you want to learn how to build the most optimized deck. That's okay too. And for beginner players, don't worry about being stuck at that point where you're playing an unoptimized deck and don't know what you're doing. That's kind of the fun of it, at least in my opinion, just being able to learn new decks and slowly build your way up to gaining more experience. Back to the original question, can any deck easily win if you're really good, or does meta really influence the chance of winning on top of your own personal skill? Well, no. If you're really good, you do kind of need a good deck to go along with it, and typically the good players are really good at making good decks, or let's use the proper terminology I've been using, very skilled players are very good about making optimized decks, which are better. So generally speaking, their own personal decks, they'll probably have pretty good win percentages with it, just because they built it, they know how to optimize it, they know how to play it, and they will generally do well with it. But that's not to discount the fact that some decks are naturally better than others. So even if they have a really good win percentage with one deck, that's just more so them knowing what they do, and they're probably just not taking it to meta because they know it won't do too well. But the second part of that was, does meta really influence your chance of winning on top of your own personal skill? And I actually think that is kind of on the nose there, is your personal skill really does matter and playing meta really does matter, because simply put, you want to play the deck that definitely has the highest percentage chance at winning, and usually when you have a bunch of skilled players playing it who are playing it near perfectly, the statistics show which deck is naturally better than the other. So if you want a good chance at actually winning in meta and topping, you do generally want to play the meta decks to increase your own odds. But where I want to wrap up this video is with one of my own personal thoughts, and that's necessarily being a meta player and turning out results doesn't necessarily make you a highly skilled player. It means that you're highly skilled in the meta of the game, but I do think there is a lot to be said about players that are really skilled and recognize that they don't have fun playing meta and instead like to try to make just these crazy strategies work and really care about the fun of trying that stuff out, trying out new ideas to turn out the result of having fun, which is what they want. So I have to shout out Werts there. He's definitely the epitome of that, and I think that proves how much of a skilled player he is, and if he wanted to try out meta, I think he would actually do very well. And it's more so less of a honing a specific skill, and more so that Werts, I think, just by doing that, makes himself very well-rounded. But I want to hear from you all now. What are your opinions on this question of just can meta players win with any deck, or how much does meta influence? Some of this I do think is more so truth and fact, while other things I do think are a bit more of my own opinion from observing many TCGs for many years and partaking in a few of them, mostly at a casual level, but dipping into a competitive here and there. So I don't expect me to be 100% correct on this one, hence why I love the discussion down below. If you enjoyed this video, please ignore the shirt change and the slight change in lighting, and consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on a notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. And since I did mention the video, I'll have Mula and Werts' channels linked down in the description below, so you can definitely go check them out because they are awesome content creators here in the Elestral space. But with that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.